Welcome back to Old School Sports and our Out of the Park Baseball 24 playthrough of the Buffalo Wings. We are closing in on the midway point of the season. It is the first day of summer, and our Wings are having a little bit of an off year for us. If the season were to end today, we would not win the National League East. We're 2.5 games behind the Montreal Expos. Would be tied with the Dodgers for the first of the 4 wild card spots in the National League. So it's been a solid year, but not as great as some of the previous seasons as we try to get this team back to the playoffs for an 11th consecutive year and try to win a 7th consecutive NL East and hopefully ultimately a 3rd World Series championship. But right now, our attention is on the first year player draft, and appreciate those of you who have shared your thoughts on which direction we should go over the last couple of days. I wouldn't say that there's an overwhelming consensus as far as which direction to go. There are kind of 3 names out there that some of you have bandied about, and I do appreciate that input. And one of those 3 names, as I said, he's not a consensus pick, but I would say is the favorite among those who have opined. There's actually 5 players that I am thinking about picking with the pick that I will talk about right now. And then we'll go ahead and make that selection, as well as 19 other selections here in the 2038 draft. And it came down, as I said, to 5 players who I would consider taking here. One of the ones who was opined upon in the comments to the last episode is Jim Coles, 17-year-old pitcher that I do like. His ceiling certainly appears to be a bit limited, even if he reaches his full potential. There's no guarantees that he'll reach that potential, but there's also no guarantees that his potential isn't actually somewhat higher than we believe. But if he kind of develops fully to what we think he can be, he's probably a 4th starter, maybe a 3rd starter in a perfect scenario, or a 5th starter in a less than perfect scenario. So for the 38th pick in the draft, not horrible, but I think I prefer something more than that. Another guy that I actually have thought about, and I don't normally take relievers in the first round, even right at the end of the first round, but is Chris McClintock out of Missouri State. And as a college player, he's basically almost ready for the major leagues at this point. Does have high work ethic and intelligence, a ground ball pitcher that throws in the high 90s. He's got good stamina for a reliever. He's durable as far as his injury proneness. He's been facing great competition. I don't think he is a superstar closer. He's more a very good right-handed arm out of the bullpen. If he were still around in the 2nd round, I would very strongly think about taking McClintock, but I don't think I'll go that direction either. So I think I'm going to pass on the 2 pitchers that I was interested in. Part of the reason is that I think Mike Capps could be around in the 2nd round or possibly later rounds. I don't love him. He's really only a 3-pitch guy, but he's a 17-year-old prospect, throws in the mid-90s, and he's looking for $7 million. So given that we're at the final pick of the first round, that number is going to be hard for potentially a lot of other teams to justify. And we're in a situation where we actually have a ton of money this year. So even though I prefer Coles to Capps, if I could skip Coles this round and perhaps pick up a guy like Capps in the 3rd or 4th round and just have to pay nothing but money, I think that's probably the way to go. Clearly, it's conceivable that Coles, Capps, and McClintock are all gone by the time we're picking in the 2nd round. I tend to think at least 2 of them and possibly all 3 of them will be. So I have to be okay with not getting a pitcher to make the decision that I'm going to make. And I am okay with that because we're going to be going for an everyday player instead. And the three everyday players that I'm considering are the two center fielders, Eric Kettering and Jim Carter, that have been opined upon in the comments, as well as the shortstop, Alfredo Arellano. I like Arellano as a prospect. He's got good work ethic, don't love the low leadership, but not the end of the world. Is a guy who's got pretty good infield range, and if his bat fully develops, he's a slightly above average major league hitter, which with 65 range in the field could make him a guy who could play a lot of different positions. He could be a very good defensive third baseman, I think, with this profile. Could also play second or short at 6'1". He could certainly also play first. So I like him. Don't love that his speed is a little bit below average. Don't love that his error and turn double play ratings are only average. Could play him at short or second, as I said, but would prefer that those numbers be a little higher for a guy who's going to play those positions. Overall, an average-ish bat with below average speed and a versatile glove is a guy who has some value, but I ultimately decided that I'm going to go with one of the center fielders. And both Carter and Kettering had some support from viewers in the comments. As I said, there's no consensus, but I think that Jim Carter is probably the most popular pick for us to take in the draft this year. As I talked about in the previous episode, and some of you have talked about in the comments, he's got a batting profile, if he fully develops, that is very similar to Deshaun Seifu, who's been a great player for us for over a decade at this point. His speed is Seifu-esque. He's got really good range in the outfield, although his error and arm ratings, at least right now, are both expected to be below average. Does have a high work ethic and low greed, so some positive personality traits for Garbage Carter. The things that I don't love, I talked about the error in the arm rating already. I don't love the fact that the competition level he's been hitting 500 against is poor. And is a guy without much home run power and without a bad eye, or with a bad batting eye. He's got those traits in common with Seifu. And the top end of his range is not quite what the top end of Seifu's range is. Now, clearly, Seifu's a player who could be headed to the Hall of Fame, so to expect a guy to be as good as him is probably a bit ambitious. But I think top end, he's not quite as good as Seifu, but still a very good player and a prospect that I'm very interested in. Also very interested, though, in the center fielder Eric Kettering, who did get some support from viewers as well. Even more positive personality traits here with the high work ethic and the low greed, as well as high leadership and loyalty in the case of Kettering. Kettering has actually been facing good competition. The numbers not quite as sparkling in terms of his batting averages and his OPS, but still very productive against higher quality competition than Carter had been facing. Not as much speed, but still a useful player on the base paths and a better bunter than Carter. The offense is where we've got some differences. Not as good of a contact hitter, still has pretty good gap power, but he's got some home run power that Carter does not have. And he's also a little bit better in terms of his error rating and significantly better in terms of his outfield arm. So there's definitely some trade-offs between these two players, and we compare them side to side with one another. As I talked about, Carter slightly better in terms of his contact potential, his gap power potential, and his eye potential, which are significant. He's a little better in all of those, and Carter's much better in avoiding strikeouts. But Kettering has much more home run power and is potentially an above average home run power hitter, as opposed to a below average home run power hitter with Carter. So, if you were just to add up these numbers, you favor Carter a little bit. The three numbers that I care about the most, though, you give Carter +5 on contact potential, Carter +5 on eye potential, but Kettering +20 on home run power potential. So it's a little bit of a toss-up to me which direction you go there. And then defensively, as we talked about, favor Kettering with the better out or the equal outfield range, a little bit better error rating, and a much better arm. Carter does have the potential to play a couple of infield positions. Kettering could play first base. I don't know that I really would play Carter at second base. So to me, it's really close and a toss-up between these two. But I am ultimately going to go with Eric Kettering. As much as I'd love to have another Deshaun Seifu, I don't think Carter is quite that. I'm a little concerned about the competition level Carter's faced. Kettering has some personality traits that are better, a little better defensively, a little more pop in his bat, and better bunter. The downside is he's not as good in making contact, not as good in avoiding strikeouts, a little less gap power, a little less speed. To me, it's kind of a toss-up one way or the other. I don't feel incredibly strongly about this. When I did ask our scouting director to recommend a center fielder, though, he did go with Kettering over Carter, even though he has them both as 3.5-star prospects. And we are going to go ahead and bring Mr. Kettering on board here in the first round of the draft. And we made it to the second round now. Both Carter and the shortstop we had looked at are gone. Two top-ish rated players as far as position players still around. Jimmy Dryden, first baseman, who looks like he could have a little pop in his bat, pick up some walks. Not a lot of speed, not a lot going on defensively, although at 6'3" with decent infield range. Not a horrible defensive first baseman, potentially. And then Pete Willer is a third baseman, another guy not spectacular defensively, no speed, but a little bit of pop in his bat and not much else. So my hope is that there may be some options among the pitchers that we were talking about. And let's find out now whether any of them happened to fall to the second round. And it does not appear that any of them did. There is still one of the 4-star relief pitching prospects available, and there is still the alleged 3.5-star starting prospect, Chris Chastain. But as we talked about in a previous episode, if that changeup doesn't develop, he's really a reliever. But the two pitchers that we liked as far as the starters, as well as the college reliever, all gone. Perhaps not surprisingly that the 5 or 6 guys that we liked, we picked one of them. And then here around 40 picks later with supplemental picks at the end of the first round, none of those other 4 or 5 guys are still available. So can't be shocked about that. A little surprised that the guy who was looking for $7 million isn't around, but those are the breaks, and we'll try to come up with someone good to go after here in round 2 who can still help this team. And I spent some more time with the position players. Really don't like any options there, even besides the higher rated guys, according to our scout. So I think we're going to go with a pitcher here in the second round after going center fielder in the first round. The two that I've kind of ended up honing in on are the starting pitching prospect, Eric Fisher, kind of the last 3-star starting prospect out there. Like the work ethic, like the fact that he's got a potential 3-pitch arsenal. Would certainly prefer if it was a 4-pitch arsenal, but it does look like, as long as that curve develops decently, that he should be able to start. Looks like a guy who could have a little bit above average stuff, movement and control. Decent stamina, not very good at holding runners. Certainly prefer the 2 starters that we talked about a round ago. But as a consolation prize for the second round, to have been able to use that pick for a center fielder prospect that we really like, Eric Fisher is not a horrible consolation prize. Certainly is a guy who, in a best case scenario, could be a 4th starter, maybe a 3rd, possibly a 5th if things don't go quite as well as hoped. Do like the high work ethic that he has, although he does have a couple slightly negative personality quirks. So he's certainly interesting to consider here in the second round. The other guy is the highest rated relief prospect yet, Matt Dmitriev, who's tied as a 4-star prospect with the college reliever that we liked. I think potentially the ceiling for Dmitriev is actually a little bit higher, but as an 18-year-old, he's got a lot more work to do to reach that ceiling. Like the fact that he's already throwing in the mid to high 90s at 18 years old. He's already got a major league fastball, and his sinker's not that far off. If his control develops to be average, could have really good stuff and above average movement, and be a pretty useful major league reliever. I assume if we're going to go after a pitcher, that our scouting director would probably recommend the guy that he's got 4 stars on, but it's possible he would go for a starter instead. We'll see what the scout recommends. And he actually recommends the higher rated starting prospect, which does make sense, in Chris Chastain, who he thinks is a higher top end than Fisher. But Chastain, as we've talked about in the previous episodes, as much as I like the durability, stamina, ability to hold on runners, if that changeup doesn't develop, he is a reliever. And we also have some significant concerns about the amount of movement that are going to be on his pitches, which is kind of odd for a finesse pitcher who's got decent control. You would think that he'd be pretty reliant on having decent movement on his pitches to try to keep the ball in the park, since he doesn't throw all that hard. So the worry for me with him is just the amount of home runs that he could potentially give up. Although I like Dmitriev a lot, I think I want to go with the guy who could be giving us 5, 6, 7 innings an outing, as opposed to the guy who could give us an inning or two a couple times a week out of the bullpen. So I think Dmitriev is a real interesting prospect. I'm sure he's not going to be around in the third round when we pick again, but we are going to try to find lightning in a bottle with another starting pitching prospect, Eric Fisher, here in the second round. And we'll auto draft right ahead to our third round pick. And Dmitriev is gone. Just a bunch of 3-star relievers still available among the pitchers. And among the batters, Dryden and Will are still both out there. So those two are not the most popular prospects in the world, even though our scout thinks they've got some decent potential. And after some contemplation here in the third round, we're actually going to go with the 4-star prospect, Jimmy Dryden. As I said, I don't love him Above average contact, decent home run power, and above average eye are the positives for him. Don't love the lack of speed, but it's not horrible, although his base running instincts are horrible. Could be a competentious defensive first baseman, but he is a left-handed hitter who presumably will have higher ratings against right-handed pitchers when all is said and done, as we think he even does today in terms of his contact and his eye, and actually also his gap power. So as a guy who might end up in a perfect scenario being a little bit better than this against right-handed hitters who we'd likely be facing 70, 75, 80 plus percent of the time, I think just as a DH or a platoon first baseman, there could be some value there. And given that our scout thinks he's got the highest potential of anyone available, and he's not looking for all that much money, we are going to go ahead and draft Mr. Dryden here in the third round. And here in the fourth round, we're going to once again go with a guy that we didn't like in the earlier rounds, but we think Pete Willer is the highest potential guy left. Mediocre-ish glove, but a third baseman who could have plus contact with really good home run power. We don't know a lot about his personality. That could end up being good or bad. But as a fourth round pick, think there's at least a little value there. He is a guy who can hit the ball out of the ballpark. Don't love any other prospects at this point, so we'll go with the guy that our scout thinks has the most upside, with Willer in the fourth round. And didn't show it on the video, but when I was picking in the fourth round, there were these three-star relievers who were available, and they all happened to be here available in the fifth round as well. And we're going to go with Josh Moore. He's a bit older for a prospect at 19 years old. Somewhat generic right-handed reliever, but he is a guy who throws in the mid to high 90s. Got a major league fastball already, which in combination with a potentially above average splitter means he could be a useful arm out of the pen for many years. Not a top-end prospect, but we've made it to the fifth round at this point, and certainly looks like a guy who, if he develops to the way we think he could be a useful arm in our bullpen 4 or 5 years down the line. So 5 rounds through the draft now, we've made offers to everybody. Fortunately, Kettering with our first round pick was below slot in terms of his demands because our second round picks, Fisher, and our fourth round pick, Willer, both ended up being well above slot. We've offered everyone what they're looking for except for Willer. We've offered him a little bit less, but likely we'll need to eventually come back and give him what he's looking for. Give him what he's looking for to get him signed, but nothing extreme about the offers that we've made. Not really a ton of guys looking for big money or impossible to sign who are even decent prospects left in the draft, so probably not going to end up investing much more of this money into players over the last 15 rounds of the draft, but hopefully we will put ourselves into a position with fair amount of money available that we'll be able to use it to improve this roster for this season as we get closer to the trade deadline. So I'm going to go ahead and finish the last 15 rounds of the draft now. If there's anyone interesting that I end up picking, I'll certainly let you know. And we ended up over the final 15 rounds of the draft adding a couple of guys in the 7th and 8th round who are looking for a little more than they probably deserve given the slot that they were drafted in. But given that we have plenty of money to spend, we didn't mind bringing them on board. Catcher Chris Bolick is, for a 7th rounder, actually not a horrible hitting prospect for a catcher. A little below average defensively, which we don't love, not a ton of speed. I think the reason he dropped was really just the poor leadership, and he's also greedy and not the most loyal fellow in the world. But for a seventh round pick, I think it's certainly worth a flyer. Maybe can get his catcher ability a little bit better over the years, and if that bat develops, certainly a interesting backup catcher potentially. And then in the eighth round, we took Luis Manchaca, 18-year-old prospect. Like the fact that he's durable, like the high work ethic. The glove not that exciting, the speed not that exciting, but does look like a guy who can at least make decent contact with average home run power, not going to strike out, not a big-time prospect. But by the time you're getting to the eighth round, there's not really that much exciting left. So hopefully the center fielder Kettering and the starting pitching prospect Fisher will both pan out for us. And then the first baseman Dryden, the third baseman Willer, and then the reliever Josh Moore. Would hope that with those three guys, at least one of them ultimately develops into someone who can be a useful player for us at the major league level. If three of these top five picks ultimately become big league players, won't be a bad draft considering that our first pick was 38th overall and we only had 2 picks in the top 100. And with the draft in the books, we are going to call it an episode. I know this is a very short episode, but it's been about 2.5 days since the last time I posted. Been a busy week for me at work, but I wanted to at least ultimately finally react to some of the comments on what we should do in the draft and then get the draft complete. So in our next episode, we will sim up to the midway point of the season and do our annual mid-season review on where the team stands, where some of our players stand, and start making our initial assessment about the type of areas that we may be looking to improve as we get closer to the trade deadline. Until then, thanks so much for watching, and hope you have a great day.